For decades, The Conjuring captivated audiences as a terrifying supernatural tale. But few know the truth buried beneath the cinematic suspense. Behind the Hollywood facade lies a chilling and obscured reality, one that Ed and Lorraine Warren confronted firsthand, but which the world was never meant to fully see. What if the true horror wasn't just the haunting, but the deliberate attempt to bury it? The morning sun cast a golden haze over the lush rolling hills of Harrisville, Rhode Island, as the Perron family drove up the winding gravel road leading to their new home. It was 1971. Carolyn and Roger Perron, along with their 5 daughters, had long dreamed of leaving behind the bustle of city life for something simpler, more grounded, a place where their children could grow under the open sky. The farmhouse, weathered but grand in its colonial austerity, stood surrounded by trees centuries old. It was quiet here, too quiet. From the very first step inside, there was something peculiar. The house smelled of old wood, damp soil, and something else. Something sour like rotting apples. Andrea, the eldest daughter, noticed it first. "Mom," she whispered, "did you hear that?" No one else had. The creaking of the floors could easily be dismissed as age. The drafty windows that rattled even when closed, too. But there was something else beneath it all, something that unsettled the senses like a shadow you could feel but never see. The days were filled with unpacking and settling in. Carolyn found herself strangely drawn to certain rooms, particularly the basement. Cold, dark, and lined with ancient stone, it seemed to hum with a presence that didn't want to be disturbed. Roger was practical, a man of reason. He scoffed at her unease. "It's an old house," he said. "Things settle, pipes moan, nothing more." But then came the nights. The children began waking in the middle of the night, screaming about voices. Cindy claimed she saw a woman in an old dress standing in the corner of her room. April talked to an invisible friend named Rory, who told her secrets about the house. Furniture would be found moved. Clock stopped at 3:07 a.m. The family's dog refused to enter the house. Something was very wrong. It wasn't long before Carolyn began to change. She became withdrawn, often staring into corners and muttering under her breath. Bruises appeared on her body, dark, angry welts she could not explain. Roger, desperate and confused, turned to the only people he thought could help: Ed and Lorraine Warren. They arrived in early autumn. The leaves were beginning to fall, and with them came a chilling wind that never seemed to leave the property. Lorraine stepped out of the car and immediately clutched her crucifix. "There's something evil here," she said. Ed, ever the protector, gently placed his hand on her back. "Let's find out what." Ed and Lorraine Warren had seen many things, but there was something about the Harrisville farmhouse that felt uniquely disturbing. Lorraine, a clairvoyant with a profound sensitivity to spiritual energy, was visibly shaken as she entered the home. Her eyes scanned the walls, the floorboards, the very foundation, as if the house itself were breathing. The investigation began with interviews. Andrea Perron recounted her dreams, visions of hanging bodies, whispers in the night, and a woman calling her name from beneath the floor. Cindy described a man with hollow eyes who would stand at the foot of her bed and whisper in a language she didn't understand. Even little April, who once cheerfully played with Rory, now cried herself to sleep, claiming Rory was angry and wanted her to hide. The Warrens set up their recording equipment and began nightly vigils. What they captured was terrifying. Disembodied voices, temperature fluctuations, objects moving on their own. None of it could be explained by natural means. On one occasion, a wooden chair flung across the room as Ed recited a prayer. Lorraine collapsed soon after, mumbling, "She's watching us." The turning point came one night when Carolyn was found standing at the edge of the basement stairs, eyes glazed over, her body stiff. Ed called her name, but she didn't respond. She began to descend slowly, step by step, whispering in a voice that was not her own. Roger managed to grab her before she disappeared into the dark. "She said she was home," Carolyn cried, "and that I had no right to be here." Lorraine's research into the house's history led to a name: Bathsheba Sherman, a midwife. In the 1800s, she had been accused but never convicted of witchcraft after a child died mysteriously in her care. Legends claimed she cursed the land and took her own life in a ritual that bound her spirit to the property. The Warrens believed Bathsheba's spirit was the source of the malevolence, targeting Carolyn as the matriarch, just as she had once been. They needed to act quickly. The longer they waited, the stronger the entity would become. But just as they prepared for a spiritual cleansing, something, or someone, intervened. A letter arrived, unsigned and typed. It warned the Warrens to cease their investigation immediately or face irreparable consequences. Roger was shaken, Ed was furious, and Lorraine only looked to the basement door and whispered, "It's afraid of being exposed." Lorraine Warren's investigation into the land's history revealed something far more sinister than even she anticipated. Harrisville, as it turned out, was a place soaked in blood and sorrow. Several homesteads in the surrounding area had histories of inexplicable deaths, suicides, drownings, and infant mortality. But all the threads traced back to a single figure, Bathsheba Sherman. Bathsheba, born in 1812, had once lived on the very land the Perrons now occupied. Town records were fragmented, but through local folklore, diaries, and church documents, Lorraine pieced together a dark and terrifying narrative. Bathsheba had been a practicing midwife, but she was whispered to have used her position for blasphemous rituals that involved newborns. One story told of a baby found with a needle impaled into the base of its skull. Though never formally charged, suspicion fell heavily on her, and she was ostracized. Locals believed she had made a pact with the devil, offering her soul in exchange for eternal dominion over the land. She died under mysterious circumstances. Her body reportedly turned to stone, though the record only lists death by unnatural causes. Before she died, she allegedly cursed anyone who tried to live on her property, proclaiming that no mother would find peace in that house again. Lorraine felt that curse vibrating through the walls. It was directed not at the children, but at Carolyn. The demonic presence had fixated on her. As the mother, she was the symbolic heart of the household, and thus the most potent vessel for Bathsheba's wrath. Carolyn began to exhibit behaviors beyond simple possession. Her voice changed at times, deepened. She was drawn to fire. She no longer remembered moments. Large chunks of time vanished from her memory. One night, Lorraine followed a faint sound into the barn behind the house. There, she found Carolyn standing alone in the dark, her arms outstretched, whispering in Latin. Lorraine snapped her out of it, but the moment revealed just how far the influence had spread. Bathsheba wasn't merely haunting them. She was trying to merge with Carolyn's soul. With every hour, the urgency grew. Ed and Lorraine decided to reach out to their contacts within the church to request a formal exorcism. But what they received was not the assistance they expected. It was resistance. The letter from the diocese arrived with an eerie formality, a denial. The church would not authorize an exorcism. The reasons were vague, couched in phrases like insufficient evidence and lack of formal ecclesiastical approval. But Ed, a seasoned demonologist, knew the truth behind those words. The church was afraid, not of demons, but of exposure. There was already tension between the church and paranormal investigators. The Vatican maintained strict protocols for possession, requiring psychological evaluations, multiple witness testimonies, and permission from higher ecclesiastical authorities. Yet, in cases like this, where the phenomena were undeniable but politically volatile, the church preferred silence over scandal. Ed and Lorraine felt abandoned, but they would not give up on the Perrons. Ed devised a plan to conduct a séance. Instead, though dangerous and unofficial, it would allow them to confront the entity and force it out. They gathered their most trusted allies, a local priest sympathetic to their cause, a nurse who had worked with the Warrens on prior cases, and a student researcher from their Nesper group who had a keen ability to sense energy shifts. The séance was held in the dining room, the center of the house's spiritual disturbance. Candles flickered in the growing dark as Lorraine reached out with her consciousness. Carolyn sat beside her, trembling, the bruises on her arms now forming strange symbols, ancient runes not seen since medieval occult texts. The moment Lorraine began to call upon the spirit, the temperature dropped sharply. Breath turned to mist. The candles extinguished all at once. Then came the noise, a low, guttural growl, like something being dragged across the wooden floor beneath them. Carolyn screamed. Her body convulsed violently, eyes rolling back into her head. The force of the possession was unlike anything they'd encountered. She levitated. Furniture crashed against walls. The crucifix in Lorraine's hand began to melt as if made of wax. And then, a voice. Not Carolyn's. She is mine. Ed shouted prayers. The priest joined him. Lorraine reached into the void, risking her mind, her spirit. She saw her, Bathsheba, her face contorted in rage, eyes black as coal, skin burned and twisted. Lorraine whispered, "You don't belong here." Bathsheba screamed, and in that scream, glass shattered, lights exploded, and Carolyn collapsed. The house fell silent. Carolyn awoke crying, sobbing for her daughters. The demon had receded, but Lorraine knew it was not gone. It was hiding, waiting. And the worst part? The footage they captured, an entire reel showing the levitation, the possessions, the growls, disappeared from their locked trunk that very night. In the days following the seance, Ed and Lorraine found themselves not only battling a lingering entity, but also facing a more insidious obstacle: institutional silence. Despite the overwhelming paranormal activity, the destruction of physical objects, the possession witnessed by multiple parties, and the now missing evidence, the church remained quiet. Lorraine penned a detailed report and personally delivered it to a diocesan contact she trusted. The reply she received was short, unsigned, and chilling in its vagueness. "We advise cessation of all activities. This case is not to proceed further under church jurisdiction." Ed, furious, began to dig. What he discovered hinted at a long-standing, unofficial policy. The church would not acknowledge hauntings or possessions unless there was no chance of public backlash. In their eyes, to recognize such a case publicly could invite scrutiny, scandal, and worst of all, legal entanglements. After all, exorcism was not just spiritual. It was legal, political, and deeply controversial. Meanwhile, Carolyn began to deteriorate again. She grew pale, emaciated, and her eyes often seemed to be looking past everyone, as if watching something only she could see. The Perron children were frightened to sleep, and Roger was near breaking point. "They won't help us," he said, bitterly to Ed. "What kind of faith refuses to fight evil?" One night, Lorraine awoke gasping. She had dreamed of a burning tree, a gallows, and Bathsheba standing beneath it, pointing at her. "Tell them to stop," the voice had said. Lorraine believed the message wasn't just for her. It was for anyone still trying to help. And it was a warning. Word began to spread in hushed circles. The Warrens received calls from allies urging them to walk away. One retired bishop even warned them that continuing could jeopardize their standing. Rumors surfaced that the Vatican was quietly monitoring the case, but not with the intention of supporting it, rather to contain it. For the first time, Ed and Lorraine considered whether this wasn't just a spiritual battle, but a political one. What were they trying to suppress? Was it the demonic presence? Or was it the truth, that evil was real and the church could no longer control its narrative? Still, the Warrens refused to back down. That decision would come at a price. Despite the increasing pressure, Ed and Lorraine intensified their documentation efforts. Every night, they set up equipment: audio recorders, thermal cameras, electromagnetic sensors. They brought in a film specialist who had worked on documenting exorcisms for private religious archives. This time, they wouldn't rely on secondhand testimony. They needed undeniable visual truth, and they got it. One night, the cameras captured something unexplainable. Carolyn, asleep on the living room couch, suddenly sat up at exactly 3:07 a.m. Her head tilted back unnaturally, mouth open, eyes rolled back. Then she began to speak, clearly in Latin. The translation later revealed a prayer, but not one of protection. It was an invocation. Then, without warning, the room's temperature dropped to sub-zero. Frost appeared on the windows. An apparition. Female. Rotting, her face twisted and eyes empty, manifested behind Carolyn. The figure placed her hands on Carolyn's shoulders, and then both vanished from the frame. The team raced into the room. Carolyn was unconscious. The air smelled of sulfur. On her arm was a burn in the shape of an upside-down cross. They had it. Physical manifestation, language acquisition, temperature shifts, full visual capture. It was undeniable. The next morning, Ed secured the footage in a locked trunk in their hotel room. But when he went to retrieve it 2 days later, the trunk was empty. There was no sign of forced entry. The film specialist swore he hadn't touched, and surveillance footage from the hotel security cameras showed nothing unusual. But Lorraine knew. Someone took it, someone who didn't want this to be seen. They began to suspect not only spiritual interference, but human involvement, possibly linked to the church or another authority with interest in silencing the case. What remained were copies of stills, fragments, and audio that hinted at the full story, but couldn't replace what was lost. The Warrens were devastated. They erased proof of evil, Ed said quietly. But why? The answer came days later, when a man in a gray suit approached Lorraine outside her hotel. He didn't give his name, only said, "Drop the case. You're meddling in something bigger than demons." She stood her ground. "We're not afraid of demons." He replied, "You should be afraid of men who keep them hidden. Thank you very much for following the story so far. Your presence up to this point is valuable to us. And I can assure you, the best is yet to come." As the Warrens pressed forward, they encountered a new, unexpected form of resistance. Not from the spirit realm, nor from the church, but from the very community they were trying to protect. Harrisville, a small town built on generations of pride and secrecy, was beginning to turn on the Perron family. At first it was subtle. Neighbors no longer waved. The local grocer stopped delivering to the farmhouse. Whispers followed the children. At school, stories of witches, madness, and devil worship. People were afraid, not just of what might be haunting the Perrons, but of what might happen if the outside world discovered it. Roger was approached by a town councilman who offered to help them relocate quietly, under the condition that the family cease speaking to the press or any investigators. It was clear they wanted the problem gone, not solved. Lorraine tried to hold a community meeting at the local church to share the facts, to present the evidence they still had. But the doors were locked. A note posted outside read, "No gatherings permitted for non-ecclesiastical affairs." The church, it seemed, had joined the effort to suppress. Ed was furious. They would rather let a family suffer than admit, "This place is cursed." Even within their own network, divisions were forming. Some of the Warrens' colleagues backed away, afraid of being blacklisted or worse. Others began to question whether the family's plight was being exaggerated. "How do we know this isn't hysteria?" one investigator asked. But it was no hysteria. One night, while driving home from town, Roger and Andrea's car was forced off the road by an unmarked black vehicle. The occupants never emerged. The car simply idled nearby, then drove off once the Perrons had recovered themselves. It was intimidation, plain and simple. Carolyn, deteriorating by the day, spoke less and less. When she did, it was often in voices, not her own. Her skin had developed a grayish hue. Her presence was icy, even to her daughters. April refused to enter the same room as her mother. Lorraine, now convinced that human forces were aiding the supernatural, reached out to an old contact, an ex-priest turned occult archivist who had once dealt with similar resistance in Europe. He confirmed her fears. This is not about one demon. It's about preserving a lie. The haunting had grown from a spiritual battle into a war of truth versus fear. Harrisville's silence wasn't just shame, it was protection. But who? Or what were they protecting? The answer lay not in the attic or the basement, but deep within town records that hadn't seen daylight in decades. The basement of Harrisville's town hall was a vault of forgotten history. Lorraine, accompanied by Andrea and the archivist, began digging through boxes labeled with dust-covered dates. What they found stunned them. There were property records showing that the land the Perron house stood on had once been the site of not just Bathsheba's homestead, but of a colonial gallows. Executions had taken place there, mostly of women, accused of witchcraft. Some documented, many not. Among the names were 3 women who died under mysterious circumstances in the 1700s. All their names had been erased from church burial records. One of them, Lorinda Wells, had a detailed accusation next to her name. She spoke to shadows. She cursed the birth of every firstborn. It was a pattern. Generation after generation, women connected to the land were tormented, accused, and silenced. Lorraine realized that Bathsheba might not have been the origin, but the last in a line of victims turned vessels. Further evidence came in the form of a sealed envelope in a locked drawer. It was a letter from 1938, written by a Reverend John Macaulay. It warned of a spiritual contagion surrounding the property and described an attempted exorcism that went horribly wrong. The priest who led it was later institutionalized, his notes confiscated by church officials. More chilling still was a microfilm reel containing interviews from the 1950s with townspeople who reported similar phenomena: cold spots, disembodied voices, possession-like states. But none of those records ever made it into public archives. They had been hidden, buried. Lorraine was furious. They knew. They've always known. Ed took what documents he could and began preparing a report to be delivered to media contacts. If the church wouldn't speak, if the town refused to act, then they would expose the truth themselves. But that night, their motel room was ransacked, documents shredded, audio tapes destroyed, the microfilm reel smashed. Only one thing remained intact: a single photograph of Carolyn Perron standing at the gallows tree, eyes black, with a faint silhouette behind her. It was Bathsheba, watching, and she was not alone. By the time winter crept into Harrisville, the Warrens knew they had one chance left. Carolyn's state had worsened to the point of near death. She was no longer eating, barely responding, and frequently vanished into the basement, where she'd be found hours later in a trance, chanting in dead languages. The children were no longer safe around her. Roger, defeated, begged Ed and Lorraine, "If you're going to do something, it has to be now." They gathered a small team: Ed, Lorraine, the former priest now operating outside of church jurisdiction, and Tony Spera, their trusted aide. With the church refusing to authorize an exorcism, they knew what they were about to attempt was both dangerous and unauthorized. But there was no other way. That night, a storm descended over Harrisville. Thunder echoed like cannon fire, and the house trembled with every bolt of lightning. The seance was to be held in the cellar, Bathsheba's lair. They descended with candles, sacred relics, and every ounce of spiritual protection they could summon. Carolyn was already there, seated in the darkness. She turned her head slowly, eyes vacant. "You came too late," she hissed. The moment Ed began the ritual, the room erupted. The air grew thick, heavy. The candles extinguished one by one. Something unseen moved among them, brushing past, clawing at their legs. Carolyn's body twisted violently, levitating once more. Lorraine saw them. Not just Bathsheba, but others. 5 women, broken, anguished, screaming without sound. Victims of centuries-old injustice, their pain forged into the curse that had now taken root in Carolyn's soul. Lorraine cried out, reaching into the spiritual void, "This is not your prison. She is not your vessel." Ed, reciting Latin with the priest, raised a crucifix as Carolyn lunged at him, snarling like a wild animal. Her strength was inhuman. The crucifix burned against her skin, smoke rising from her forehead, and then silence. A single moan echoed, deep and long, as if from beneath the ground itself. Carolyn collapsed, blood seeping from her nose. For a moment, they thought she had died, but then she opened her eyes, soft, human. It was over. Bathsheba's hold was broken, but not destroyed. The curse was fractured like a mirror, its shards Still dangerous, still waiting. The house stood in silence as the storm outside ceased. The wind was gone, the voices silenced. For now. In the weeks that followed, the Perrons began to recover. Carolyn, though weak and haunted by what she endured, regained her identity. The children slept through the night for the first time in months. Roger, eternally grateful, embraced Ed and Lorraine like family. But peace was short-lived. Word of the unsanctioned ritual spread quickly. The church issued a quiet condemnation, distancing itself entirely. Ed and Lorraine received letters from multiple dioceses, warning them not to publicize their findings. Their contacts grew cold. Their scheduled lectures were canceled. Then came the disinformation. Local newspapers published articles suggesting the Perrons had fabricated the events. Anonymous experts questioned the Warrens' credibility. The family was painted as unstable, opportunistic. A fabricated psychiatric evaluation of Carolyn surfaced in a tabloid, claiming she had a history of delusional episodes, a claim Roger vehemently denied. Every trace of what had occurred was being systematically erased. The house was later sold, but not before all public records regarding the Perrons' ownership were sealed. The new owners were warned not to speak to the media. Lorraine called it a spiritual blackout. Years later, when Hollywood adapted the story into the Conjuring, Lorraine served as a consultant. But even she admitted quietly that the film was only a shadow of what had truly transpired. They told the story they were allowed to tell, she once said, not the one that needed to be told. To this day, much of the evidence gathered during the Perron case remains missing. Tapes, photographs, first-hand testimonies, gone. As if something or someone ensured the world would never know the full truth. But the house remains. So do the whispers. And in the basement, beneath layers of dirt and stone, the memory of Bathsheba Sherman waits. Not in peace, but in patience. The Perron haunting wasn't just about spirits. It was about suppression, fear, and the cost of truth. What do you believe really happened in Harrisville? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to watch our next story. You won't believe which case they tried to erase from history,